Next up, we have muscles of the neck. And we're going to start with one muscle that's probably the most important muscle for lab, and that is our sternocleidomastoid. This is important because it's going to help us define different regions of the neck. It's also one of the more prominent ones, so it's a great candidate for a lab exam question. Let's break this word down first. So, sterno is going to refer to one attachment of the sternocleidomastoid. We have cleido as well, and we have mastoid. So all of these are going to give us information about where our sternocleidomastoid is attaching. So the more inferior attachments are going to be on the sternum and the clavicle. And we technically have two heads of the sternocleidomastoid. That is the muscle we see here, number 28. And what's going to happen is the sternocleidomastoid will run down to insert onto our sternum and our clavicle. So these are attachment points 1 and 2. More superiorly, we have that last part of the word, mastoid, referring to the superior attachment point. So the sternocleidomastoid, we'll stick with this image. What's happening is it's going to insert onto our mastoid process. And just to review, the mastoid process is that bony projection you can palpate right behind your ear, that little bump of bone. It's part of our temporal bone. So in this case, sternocleidomastoid, the name is entirely referring to the attachment points of this muscle. Now, this muscle is super important because it has a couple different actions. One of these is bilateral. So that means two sides. So when both of our sternocleidomastoids on either side of our neck are contracting, we get this bilateral contraction, which flexes our head. And you can try this on yourself. I want you to put your hands, if you want to put your fingers kind of on that pulse point below your jaw, and then about 2 inches below that. As you contract and flex your neck, you're going to feel a muscle moving on each side. You're going to feel it even more if we do what's called a unilateral contraction. So sternocleidomastoid is special because when only one side contracts, that is what helps us rotate our head to the opposite side. So same thing, if you put your fingers on your neck, rotate your head to the right, you're going to feel a muscle on the left side contracting to help you rotate. That's going to be that unilateral contraction in the opposite direction from the flexing muscle. So we've talked a lot about actions that might give you a hint that it might be a good idea to know sternocleidomastoid actions for the lab exam. Maybe a hint for a question to identify this muscle. And now we talk a lot about this because this muscle also helps us define two regions of the neck. In this case, they're called triangles. And we're going to have an anterior and a posterior triangle of the neck. So anterior triangle is going to be everything anterior to our sternocleidomastoid, and then we're going to have this posterior region here. So they roughly make the shape of a triangle. It's not an exact diagram. So we're going to use that sternocleidomastoid muscle to help us orient ourselves. Now, these triangles are relevant because they're going to contain all major neck structures, some of which you don't need to know right now. So things like all the major glands, nerve, blood vessels running to the head are going to pass through these triangles. And we'll talk just briefly about different plexuses of nerves in the body, but things like our cervical plexus are going to be associated with some triangles of the neck. So it's just good to know these triangles are clinically relevant. If you go on to take higher level classes, we'll talk more about them in detail. So the anterior triangle, it's bordered by, number 1, our mandible, number 2, our sternocleidomastoid, and then number 3, our clavicle, which is going to be kind of that most inferior border. So they're going to make that rough triangle shape. Posterior triangle, again, we have that sternocleidomastoid border, number 1, trapezius on the other side, and then inferiorly we'll have that clavicle again, making that rough triangle shape. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on the contents of these triangles right now, but we want to talk about some of the muscles you would find in these areas, starting with that anterior triangle. So anterior triangle has some subdivisions, so it can get really gnarly to learn. So let's go to our anterior view and redefine that triangle. So up top, we have the mandible. This is going to be our sternocleidomastoid. And then we are just going to draw a midline through that triangle. So basically we've created two smaller triangles here. Not a big deal right now. It's just geometry. So within these triangles, let's look at just one of them. Erase this here. Within kind of one of those half triangles, we have two groups of muscles. We have muscles above our hyoid, which is right here, our hyoid bone. And we have muscles below our hyoid. So that's going to be everything in this region. These are sometimes referred to as our strap muscles, and that is solely based on appearance. So these guys look like straps. You could think about a belt kind of running through our hyoid here. That's literally all that name means. So strap muscles, they're strap-like, they're really long. They look like straps of leather or something like that. So we're going to talk about suprahyoid muscles separate from infrahyoid muscles, and that is based on their relationship to the hyoid. Are they above or below? So let's start with those suprahyoid muscles. So just draw around our region here. And these, the nice thing about them is they refer to the attachment points in the name. The not so nice thing about them is they all look very similar to each other. So these suprahyoid muscles are going to be a group of 4. So I'm going to write out their names here, and we're going to break those names down. So we have stylohyoid, digastric, mylohyoid, and geniohyoid. So right away, one of the patterns we can see here, hyoid. This tells us all of these, including the digastric, are attaching to our hyoid. Now, a couple of these names have other information about attachment points. Stylohyoid, which is this muscle in yellow in the image, has an attachment point to our styloid process of the temporal bone. And we'll look at a lateral view in just a second so you can see that attachment. Let's skip digastric for now. Mylohyoid, we still have information about the attachment point, but in this case, mylo is not going to give us much information about an attachment point. This muscle, I just write the term muscle, so to me, this looks like the most muscular, so to speak, out of all the muscles. It's a broad sheet here, kind of forming that floor of our mouth, of our oral cavity. And then we have geniohyoid. Again, not much information about the attachment other than that it's attaching to the hyoid. But this guy is going to be kind of along the midline of our suprahyoid muscles. So mylohyoid is going to form that kind of muscular floor of our oral cavity. Geniohyoid is along the midline here. It's just straight up and down. And then we haven't talked about digastric yet. This one's a little weird. So we do get information from the name here. Di means 2. And so this tells us it has 2 heads. And we can see that. Basically, the mylohyoid is this muscle in green that's kind of slinging around. So this is going to be head 1. This is head 2. And it's slinging around a little bit of connective tissue of the hyoid. So you don't need to know things like attachments. I'm not going to ask you that on the lab exam. It's enough to identify these muscles, but these are things that might pop up in lecture, so I want to make sure I'm going over them with you. So stylohyoid, we get a lot of information about the attachment point, hyoid and styloid process. Digastric tells us it's 2 heads, so we can see head 1 slinging around and then head 2. Mylohyoid, I think M for muscle, this is forming that muscular floor of the oral cavity. And then geniohyoid is, by process of elimination, it's kind of this last up and down muscle that we see here. So let me get rid of our markings here so you can have this to review. So that is going to be our suprahyoid muscles. Now for these, I would definitely recommend drawing them. I know it's a pain, but drawing them is going to force you to recognize these attachment points. So I found this sample sketch. It is from drawittonowit.com, but this is a great idea of kind of the level of sketch you can do. So it doesn't have to be pretty. You don't have to get every single detail of the skull, but we have things here like attachment points. So we just talked about the stylohyoid. It has, of course, this common attachment point at the hyoid, but what happens is it's going to run all the way up to our styloid process of our temporal bone. And we can see that here from the sketch. Same thing for the digastric. So we've got belly 1 or head 1 here, and then head 2 is going to sling around and attach to our mastoid process. And so this view is really helpful, and this kind of sketch would be helpful to force you to make those connections. And then our other two, we've got our mylohyoid forming that really broad muscular floor of the oral cavity, and then geniohyoid is going to be our last guy here running up and down. Okay. So again, sketches don't have to be pretty, but I really do highly recommend it. That's exactly what I did for Cadaver Lab, and it really helped me when I got to these strap muscles. So that was all suprahyoid. We're going to look at the infrahyoid muscles now. So different kind of compartment. So infrahyoid is going to be everything below the level of our hyoid bone right here. We do get a lot of information from these names. So let's start with this guy on the outside in blue. This is going to be our omohyoid. And this is another one with two bellies. So we see a superior belly here and then an inferior belly here. Info we learned from the name is, of course, it's attaching to the hyoid, and then omo refers to shoulder. So what's happening is this muscle is slinging around and attaching down here along our scapula, along that superior border. See that on this side a little better. So that's going to be omohyoid. Sternohyoid is kind of the next one here in yellow. Sternothyroid. Got to be careful with those names. Sternothyroid is attaching from the sternum to the level of our thyroid gland and our thyroid cartilage. So we are not going to focus on cartilage in this class, but it might be helpful to know. Anytime you see the term thyroid or thyro, that's referring to these structures, these cartilaginous structures in here. So sternothyroid is only going to go about halfway up our neck here, and it stops at the level of the thyroid. Same thing for thyrohyoid, only it's opposite now. So thyroid means it's starting at the thyroid level. Hyoid means it's going to go all the way to our hyoid. So it's going to be this guy here. And then lastly, we have our sternohyoid. So this one is like a much more familiar pattern for us. It's going all the way from our sternum to our hyoid bone. So very straightforward here. So I know these words are easy to confuse, but if you really think about what the terms mean and where these attachment points are, it makes it a lot simpler. So we've talked about kind of three different levels here. We've got the level of the sternum, the level of the thyroid cartilage, and then we have our hyoid. So between these three different points, this is how we can name most of the muscles of the infrahyoid region. Here's a slightly different perspective. So one of the more confusing things for students is when we talk about these weird muscles that sling around. So things like our digastric and our omohyoid that have two bellies. So this is just a different perspective. I always recommend using the sternocleidomastoid to orient yourself. So this is a really prominent muscle defining that boundary of the anterior triangle. And so within here, if we take out all the other muscles, we'll be left with these two bellied muscles. So the digastric was part of that suprahyoid muscle group. It's got one head here and then a second head slinging around. And then our omohyoid is that one with a more superior belly here, and then a more inferior belly going towards the shoulder region. So just a different perspective to help you start figuring out these muscles. Okay, so that is it for neck muscles. I don't want to overwhelm you too much. Let's just talk about what would be realistic to ask on the lab exam, because a lot of these muscles we can't see so clearly. Things like omohyoid are really small. So let's go back to our model here. Okay, so a really good candidate here would be sternocleidomastoid, because it's clinically relevant for making these triangles, and it's also really prominent. So look out for that one on a lab exam. We can see some of the strap muscles from our model, but they are truly not going to be a priority for the lab exam. There's many other muscles I can ask, things like facial muscles, temporalis, frontalis, that are really easy to label, and they're less likely to be confused. So hopefully that gives you a hint for what to study. And then just briefly, I want to talk about the posterior triangle of our neck. So there are a lot of good muscles here that we can clearly define. You will see some of these pop up again when we talk about the pectoral girdle or the superficial muscles of the back. So some of these muscles will have a bit of overlap between labs. Let's get these out of the way. Okay, so we have our posterior triangle of the neck. Border 1 is going to be sternocleidomastoid. Trapezius is forming that posterior border. And then down here, our clavicle would kind of be defining that triangle. So we have scalenes in the posterior triangle. We're going to have a levator scapulae on either side. We've got some splenius muscles. And so let's go ahead and break these down. So our scalenes are going to be the most anterior muscles that we see. And let's get a different color here. So we have a anterior, middle, and a posterior scalene. Posterior is not so visible. It is kind of tucked away here, so don't worry about that one. We are mostly concerned about anterior and middle scalenes. There we go. Arrows all over the place. So anterior and middle scalenes are going to be these guys here. So kind of that number 37 on our model. They're a little bit tucked under sternocleidomastoid, but they're going to be that most anterior part of our posterior triangle. And what they're doing is they're helping to flex and rotate the neck. So generally, muscles in the neck are going to do neck flexion, neck extension, or rotation, some combination thereof. So you can use this. This is like a common action for tons of muscles in the neck. So try to parse through which ones are going to flex, which ones will extend, which are going to rotate. In this case, scalenes are going to help flex and rotate. When they shorten towards each other, they're going to bring the neck towards the shoulder, hence helping to rotate it. Our splenius is going to be the most posterior of the neck. So let's get this out of the way. So if we skip some of the muscles in the middle, this little triangle of muscle up here is our splenius muscle. And technically there are two heads, so we've got a splenius capitis and cervicis. But for this class, if you say splenius on the exam, that would be totally fine. These are helping to extend and rotate head and neck. So note the difference in position here. Scalenes are more anterior. When they contract, they're going to help flex the neck, bring it forward. Splenius is more posterior, so when this muscle contracts, it's going to bring the head this way and extend the neck. So think about those positions and how they're going to affect the action of the muscle. And then lastly, in the middle here, we have our levator scapulae, and that's going to be this guy, number 36. And if we break this term down, levator means elevate, like we just saw. So this muscle is going to elevate our scapula. It's going to move them superiorly. Okay? And so the way I would identify these is find your sternocleidomastoid first. That's always going to be a border of a triangle. The next muscle you see here, anteriorly, those are going to be our anterior and our middle scalenes. Anterior number 1, middle a little further back. Skip the muscle in the middle, find our most posterior muscle, which is going to be splenius, and then the remaining muscle in the middle is going to be our levator scapulae. And this is definitely one you're going to want to practice in class when you have the models in front of you. Okay? That is posterior triangle. And then next up, we'll continue with the back and the torso.